Janice, if you want to start things off.
Okay, give me 1 second. Sorry about that. Hi, everyone. It's my pleasure today to introduce Rachel Dickler and Amy Adair. We'll both be speaking about Inkits and Ink Blotter. These are tools to support students and teachers to realize the next generation science standards. I'm very proud to introduce these students. Rachel is a fifth-year student in my lab and will be leaving us soon to take up a postdoctoral research associate position at University of Boulder, Colorado, on a $20 million AI grant with the National Science Foundation. And Amy is finishing her second year in my lab, and she recently was awarded quite a very nice NSF graduate research fellowship. So I'm very, very proud of these two students, and very excited for what they're going to tell you, the research they've been working on this year.
Yes, so Amy and I are really excited to share some of these projects with you that we've been working on under Janice's advisement. And in this presentation, we'll first just give you some context for two studies that we've conducted, one that we did previously and one that's still ongoing. And then we'll tell you a bit more about some of our future research as well. So just to get into some background context, currently, there is a growing emphasis on STEM fields or science, technology, engineering, and mathematics fields. The challenge is that the students in the United States are really struggling in these areas and underperforming on international benchmarks as well as national benchmarks. And so there's been this need to think about how we can support our students and revise the ways in which we've been delivering our instruction. And so this has resulted in reform efforts such as the Next Generation Science Standards, which really place an emphasis on inquiry within science. So having our students engage in investigations, asking questions, and trying to think about not just the scientific phenomenon that's happening, but also developing critical 21st century skills and practices. And so to give you an idea, here are the 8 science inquiry practices that are outlined in the Next Generation Science Standards. So they include things like that we want our students to master skills related to planning, carrying out investigations, as well as constructing explanations. And all of these practices are really important, but at the same time, there are some challenges related to assessing and supporting our students on these inquiry practices. So when it comes to assessing and supporting inquiry, first, we have a challenge that the inquiry practices are not particularly well defined. So this makes them really difficult to operationalize, then correspondingly measure in classrooms. And also we know that inquiry practices are really challenging, not only for students, but also for educators. This is a totally different way of approaching science versus just focusing on memorizing science content. So we need to think about ways that we can scaffold our students on these practices. And then also, because science inquiry is multidimensional, we have all these different types of understandings that are involved in successfully engaging in inquiry practices. So this includes, understanding of the procedures involved in practices, but also understanding key concepts and also the scientific concepts. So there is so much happening. And so it's really important for us to think of ways to support our students and our teachers around science inquiry instruction. And there's been a lot of movement in the field of educational technology to create different tools to support both our students and our teachers. So for instance, we have online science environments that automatically assess how students are doing in an inquiry investigation, and then can provide scaffolds to our students. And these include virtual labs. We've seen programs like Sim Scientists, for example, that will have students go through steps involved in inquiry and then provide, for instance, a pop-up message that will help the student to then move through and navigate the environment, correct their prior errors. But there's been a number of studies that show that in addition to scaffolds within online environments, also teacher support and teacher mediation can really add value to students' inquiry learning. So not just having these automated scaffolds within the environment. And so this is where technologies like teacher dashboards come into play. And teacher dashboards, These are tools that can be accessed on a computer or a tablet device through a website. And essentially the teacher is able to look and see how their students are performing within an online environment in real time. And each dashboard looks different depending on the environment that it corresponds with, but some tools will provide reports of what students are contributing in the online environment or show visualizations of how students are performing, as well as give alerts, for instance, if a student completes an activity. And so on this screen, I have a screenshot from the Howard dashboard, which involves students collaborating to answer different scientific questions. And the dashboard will show a pie chart, for instance, with how much each student contributed, as well as a stream of what students have been doing in the environment. And so studies have shown that these types of tools are really beneficial for helping teachers to keep track of how their students are performing on inquiry practices. So addressing one of those key assessment challenges, but also being able to then provide support to students. But most of the dashboards available do not either address the majority of inquiry practices as outlined by the NGSS, or if they provide features like alerts, those alerts are only on if students, for example, completed an activity, not on how the student was performing within the activity and specific difficulties that they had. And so this brings us to the INKITS, Inquiry Intelligent Tutoring System, and InkBlotter Teacher Dashboard, which explicitly address student performance on inquiry practices. And so how it works is, at first, we just had students engaging in our inquiry intelligent tutoring system. And as they worked, all of their actions are stored. And we use automated scoring algorithms to see how our students are performing on different science inquiry practices. So carrying out investigations, for example, and analyzing their data. And then if a student is assessed as having difficulty, we can have our tutor, our virtual tutor Rex, who can pop up and provide support to the student. And then that cycle will continue. But we wanted to understand how also we could engage teachers in this loop and have teachers provide that additional support to students as well to help them on their inquiry practice difficulties. And so that led us to the development of our InkBlotter Teacher Dashboard. So now that automated scoring can also be used to trigger alerts to our teachers in real time. And then our teachers, when in person, can respond walking up to a student to provide support based on the alerts in our dashboard, or we've had remote studies recently as well, where teachers will be able to go into breakout rooms or speak to students over virtual meeting platforms to provide support. And what's really important to note about these technologies is that in addition to looking at how students are performing on inquiry practices, we're breaking down practices into the different components or sub-practices that are involved. And so because assessment is in INKITS is taking place at that sub-practice level, we can provide alerts to teachers with really detailed, fine-grained information that is actionable and allows teachers to then provide support to students based on that information. And what we've seen is that when teachers use our InkBlotter dashboard, our students correspondingly improve on the inquiry practices on which they're helped in future activities. And while those studies showed that and showed that students who were in a classroom where InkBlotter was used improved more so than when no InkBlotter dashboard was available, we had not yet looked at how exactly the teachers were using the dashboard. And so we weren't able to really understand what exactly the dashboard alerts were maybe facilitating from our teachers that then led to improvement. And we know that prior studies have shown discourse between teachers and students can explain a lot in terms of students' science performance. So in our current work, we wanted to take a look at what are teachers saying in response to InkBlotter dashboard alerts that might facilitate student improvement. And there are a lot of different ways to look at discourse, but one discourse analytic technique that we've been applying is called epistemic network analysis. And so what this method does is it allows us to look at different types of supports our teachers provide and then see how they are interrelated and allow us to compare patterns of support when a student improves or not. So for example, here is a visualization of what a network might look like. And it's a 2D representation showing us we have different types of supports the teacher provide, for instance, related to a science inquiry practice. They might help them with understanding content, as well as understanding other concepts related to the practices. And so in our network, we have different dots or little circles here that represent the different types of supports that teachers provide. And then the connections, these lines, depending how dark they are, that indicates how frequently certain types of supports might co-occur. So a teacher is helping a student for a little bit, and we can see how they implement all of these different types of supports. And then we can develop these types of networks for different situations and actually compare them both quantitatively to see if there are significant differences between them, as well as look at some of those differences in the strength of these lines. So this was a really valuable tool for us as we moved into our study to understand how ink blotter was being used in classrooms. So that brings me to our current research. Starting with our first study, we had two main research questions we wanted to look at. We'd seen that students improve when ink blotter was used previously, but now with new teachers, we wanted to first just investigate what student performance was when teachers helped them based on our alerts in the dashboard. But then also in terms of research question 2, here's where we used our epistemic network analyses. We wanted to look at whether there were differences in teacher support patterns when students improve after being helped based on the dashboard versus when they do not improve. And so for this study, we had 2 middle school teachers who participated with their students across different class periods. And all of our students completed 3 virtual Inkits lab activities. And this study took place during in-person learning prior to pandemic remote learning. And our teachers were able to use our ink blotter dashboard while our students completed Inkits labs. And so our teachers could then provide support to students if students seemed to be having difficulties. And we were able to actually capture audio recordings of those interactions when the teachers responded to those alerts. So to give you an idea of what our Inkits virtual lab activities look like, all of our labs have 4 stages at the middle school level. So in the first stage, this is an example from our flower lab. The students are given a scientific goal to investigate. And so they ask questions or make a hypothesis about the goal. And they do that using different drop-down menus. And then they move on to use a simulation to collect data to investigate the question that they set out. And then they go on to interpret their data, and they can go back and collect more data if they feel that is needed. And then they end by summarizing their findings in the claim, evidence, and reasoning format. What is interesting is that as students are moving through these first 3 stages, we're able to store their actions and then use that to automatically score their performance. We've since added automated scoring for students' written explanations as well, but at the time of the study, we just had automated scoring on these first 3 stages. And so the automated scoring for each inquiry practice stage takes place at a sub-practice level. So each stage has multiple components or steps that we're looking at for our students to complete. And what this does is it allows us to capture student performance at a fine-grained enough level that then we can provide really targeted support and understand some of the different ways in which our students are performing. For instance, when students are carrying out investigations, we're looking to see first if they are designing a controlled experiment, if they're running sufficient trials to understand the scientific phenomenon, and if they're exploring the particular question that they set out from the beginning. And so each of these little sub-practices here could be scored as 0 or 1 whether a student does them correctly. And then we can take the average. So for instance, if a student controlled their experiment and ran sufficient trials, but they were not testing the question they set out, that would be they got 1.1 point and 0 points. So we would take the average there and use that as their inquiry practice score. And so all of that scoring allows us then to provide real-time alerts to our teachers in the ink blotter dashboard. So here's a screenshot of what that looks like. And in the center panel, we have where the student alerts appear. So we have the student names and the specific practice that they're having difficulty with. And a teacher can actually click on one of these alerts, and then a more detailed pop-up appears on the right of the screen. So the teacher can see exactly what a student's struggling with. In this case, John was having difficulty with hypothesizing, and in particular, he was having trouble understanding what an independent variable was. So the teacher could then walk up to John, she could click this microphone button to record her interaction as she helps John and provide support so that when John goes on to hypothesize in his next activity, he will hopefully have a better understanding, be able to select that independent variable to investigate. And so while teachers are using that dashboard, we're getting data in relation to the types of alerts that they select, which students they were helping, other alerts that appeared that they did not click on at all, as well as when all of those different actions were occurring. And then in addition, in this study, when teachers pressed that microphone button, we also had audio recordings of their interactions with students. So we ended up from this study having 35 interactions that were recorded between a teacher and student. And we were able to take those, transcribe them, and code specifically what the teachers were saying in order to understand how teachers were supporting students in response to these alerts. So we had all different types of teacher supports that we were looking at. And in particular, there were 7. 4 of the types of supports were related specifically to help on inquiry practices. So for instance, if a teacher provided orienting support to a student, and so they directed the student's attention to the practice based on the alert, or if teachers provided a conceptual explanation of what was happening with the inquiry practice. We also looked at whether any procedural support was provided, so teachers generally explaining what's involved in a practice, as well as more instrumental support where teachers essentially tell the students the exact information they need to move on for that practice and that specific activity. As well as in this study, we looked at if teachers asked students any questions about scientific content or provided any information to students related to the content, as well as if they provided any evaluative statements telling the student, for instance, like this work is incorrect or this work is great, this is correct. All of these different types of supports that can then impact a student as they move forward in future activities when carrying out these different inquiry practices. And so getting back to our research questions, for our first research question, we were interested just at first to see if students were improving after a teacher helped them based on an ink blotter alert. And in particular, we wanted to see if students improved on the specific practice on which they were helped. So they were having difficulty with a practice like carrying out investigations. They get help from the teacher based on an ink blotter alert. And then the student finishes that activity, they go on to do another activity. How do they perform on carrying out investigations in that activity, as well as the activity after that? So really zoning in to see the impact of teacher based on an alert on their performance. And what we also wanted to see was whether students who were helped had different trajectories in their performance compared to students who did not receive any help. So in addition to the 35 students helped, we also had 35 students who did not receive help from the teacher. These students also had difficulty with the same practice as a student who was helped. So we matched them based on an inquiry practice difficulty, but they might not have received help from the teacher either because there wasn't enough time for the teacher to reach that student, or because the student had already moved on before the teacher was able to get to them. And so we have this comparison of 35 students who were helped compared to not helped. And so we were able to look at the differences in their performance across activities and see if there was any differences in relation to help from the teacher based on blotter using a mixed model analysis of variance. And so the results of the ANOVA that we ran revealed importantly, that there was a significant interaction between if students received help or not and their performance on the inquiry practice of difficulty across activities. So in this figure here, what we have is student inquiry performance on an activity prior to receiving help. So this is where they were struggling with the practice. The teacher then helped them, and then in the dashboard help condition, or the student did not receive any help. And then they went on to complete their second activity and third lab activity. And this is their inquiry performance at a 1 point on that practice. So the average of the sub practices. And what we saw was that students who were helped in the solid line had significant improvement, and that this improvement was greater relative to students who were not helped. Students who were not helped also improved, just not at the same rate of our students who were helped. So this supports findings that we had from prior studies, but what's important to note is that we did have some students who were helped by the teacher, but they did not improve after being helped. So while the majority of students, 80% of our students, did improve from their first to the second activity, we're looking at average scores here. So there were some students who were helped but did not improve. And so we wanted to understand in that sense, what is happening when the teacher is providing supports to students and they do not improve? Is there a difference in the type of support the teacher is providing. And so this is where we have this automated triangulation of data in INKITS, which includes the INKITS student performance data, the actions the teacher had in the dashboard, and also our audio files, which allows us to then look at whether there are differences in what teachers are saying and student performance. And in particular, what we did was we ran epistemic network analyses. And so we were able to create a network that represents when students improve. So taking basically average of all of the interactions where students improved compared to the interactions where students did not improve. And so here is an example of what those networks look like. So just to walk you through, on the left here, this is the average of when students did not improve compared to when they did improve. And all of these dots represent one of the 7 discourse codes that we applied previously. So for instance, if teachers were orienting student attention towards the practice of difficulty, or if they asked them more questions about content, and then the connections between these codes, how dark the line is for the connection represents how frequently particular types of supports co-occurred. So for instance, in the no improvement group, we can see that there was a frequent amount of content questioning and orienting supports that were co-occurring. So teachers might direct a student's attention towards the practice and then ask them a question about the scientific phenomenon that was occurring. And so what's really interesting is the epistemic network analysis lets us compare these patterns, and we saw that there was a significant difference. And we can really see the difference in patterns when we subtract the no improvement network from the improvement network, which means that we look at the difference in weights between the 2 networks, and that lets us see where the connections were stronger. And what we get when we do that is this network here. So the red lines here represent certain patterns that happen more frequently when students did not improve compared to the blue lines when students did improve. And we see that when students were not improving, the combinations of supports, the patterns in teacher support, were really focused around the scientific phenomenon, the content, and just initially directing student attention towards the practice. But those supports did not include more procedural support, for example, explaining to students the steps involved in the practice more generally, or evaluations on how the student was performing. And so this shows us that there's this really important level of not just having students supported on the content involved in practices, but also focusing on elements of the practices themselves if we want our students to continue to improve on the practice of difficulty. And that as a part of this, we need to kind of think about, in the sense of providing student with scientific content help, if they move on to a virtual lab investigation that has totally different scientific phenomenon involved, it's unlikely that that support that the student received in their first activity would apply in their future activity. And so more general inquiry practice support would have benefited them more. And so this first study was promising in that it showed how those real-time alerts with detailed information about student difficulties could help to direct our teachers to identify when students were struggling and provide support that, for the most part, was associated with student improvement. But there was a difference in these support patterns when students improved or not. So it leads us to consider how we can better, in future iterations of the dashboard alert design, facilitate teacher support that's not just related to scientific content, but also encourages discussion of the inquiry practices and other types of understandings involved, like conceptual and procedural understandings related to the practice. And so this has really important implications for us as we move forward with designing some of those iterations, especially because we've seen in prior work how sometimes just providing examples to teachers of sample prompts can be really effective in helping them to think about ways to facilitate conversation around inquiry practices in the future. And so this led us to our inquiry practice supports, or TIPS project development. And I'm going to hand it over now to Amy, who's going to tell you more about that.
Thank you. So just to reiterate some of the motivation behind the teacher inquiry practice supports development. So, as Rachel mentioned, we want to help teachers actually facilitate these kind of rich supports that they would give to students around the inquiry practices. So we're trying to think about ways to give teacher those types of prompts, perhaps directly inside of the teacher dashboard. And so this is where we came up with TIPS. So TIPS stands for Teacher Inquiry Practice Supports, and these are these prompts that are directed specifically at supporting students' inquiry practices. And they're going to be embedded right into the alerts in Inkblotter, which is the teacher alerting dashboard. And there's 4 categories of supports for the TIPS, and these are based off of the categories that Rachel mentioned in the code book for the first study. So, first we have this orienting type of support, which is directing the student to a specific practice or even a specific sub-practice within the fuller practice. There's the conceptual, explaining the inquiry practice or sub-practice, procedural, informing them about the steps, and then instrumental, which is the exact actions that the student would take inside the system. And so for an example, we can actually show you, before we go on to the example, I'll talk a little bit about the development process of how we actually constructed these tips. So using the same teacher spoken segments, the 219 segments from study 1, the 2 middle school teachers, that were already coded for the orienting, conceptual, instrumental, and procedural categories of support, we were able to filter out these segments for the exact segments that teachers had spoken that help students to improve on the practice. So we were actually able to take these highly effective things that teachers had said and construct the tips based off of these things that teachers had said in real time. And we were able to embed those tips into the Inkblotter system. And so here's an example of what it would look like. Right underneath the alert, so we have that the student is struggling to understand what an independent variable is. That's the specific sub-practice that the student is struggling with. Right underneath, we can actually click on press for tips. And what the teacher will see is, here's kind of a zoom in to what the teacher would see whenever they press for tips. They would have these 4 categories, and the first level is orienting support. So they could ask the student, what is your independent variable? They're directing the student to that specific sub-practice. And then for the conceptual support, the teacher could ask, remember, an independent variable is the thing you want to change. So defining what an independent variable is. And then for procedural, it kind of combines these 2 together. Look at the goal and think about which variable you're going to change in your investigation. Trying to, provide some of those steps that would be involved for identifying the independent variable. And then finally, the instrumental support is that kind of bottom out hint of your independent variable should be the amount of ice, for example, if this is the phase change activity, the amount of ice, because this is what you are going to change. And so with these tips now developed, we're kind of in the preliminary stages of our study 2, where we're investigating how teachers are using Inkblotter with tips. So we've begun looking at this data that we've collected from this past fall and this spring, and we're collected data from 4 teachers from different schools. 2 were fully online, synchronous with their students. 1 was in person and 1 was hybrid, where they had both students in person and online at the same time. But all 4 teachers used Inkblotter with tips as their students were completing the Inkits labs. And we interviewed these teachers about their experiences after they used Inkblotter with tips. And so some of the data that we've been collecting includes the Inkblotter with tips log data. So everything that the teacher clicks inside of the Inkblotter alerting dashboard, the types of alerts they click, the types of tips or supports that the teacher's selecting, and the timestamps of when they select it. The audio recordings. So one beneficial thing about conducting research during this COVID time is that so many people have access to these video conferencing softwares. So we're able to obtain the audio recordings through either Zoom or Google Meets. And then we also have our notes from the teacher interviews after the teachers who'd used Inkblotter with tips. And so our initial analyses mainly focuses on these teacher interviews and examining that data for the initial themes for how tips impacted teachers supporting their students. And so what we found initially are these 3 themes. 1 is design recommendations for improving the usability of Inkblotter with tips. And 2 of them involve how tips have helped teachers a lot of teachers have indicated that teachers have helped them differentiate levels of support and help them with their timeliness. And so I'll go into these themes a little more right now. And so that first theme, we have the design recommendations for improved usability. So one of those involve removing the need to press for tips. So without the explicit instruction, whenever we met with the teachers beforehand, it could be kind of confusing to figure out where to press for these prompts that they could use to help their students. So that's one suggestion for improved usability. Another is also simplifying the language of the tips terminology. Sometimes like orienting, conceptual, procedural, instrumental, these are not necessarily words that teachers are going to be using to describe the kinds of support and scaffolds that they give to students. So simplifying that language to make it more accessible for teachers in the moment to use that right within, streamline it into their normal instructional practices. And then there's also updating the graphics. So we have right now, they're kind of constructed as arrows to show this, broader to more specific kind of progression. But we could also change that kind of graphic to kind of indicate more that teachers can, go from different, they don't have to necessarily start with the first one. They can choose which one is best with their knowledge of the student that they're helping. And so our second theme, we move on to kind of how teachers have been noting how tips were helpful in their classroom instruction. So one of the things that one teacher said was, in general, it was helpful to remind me to not jump straight to giving kids the answers. I had a few kids surprise me. They figured out on their own using tips more often than I thought they would. So, this is an example of a teacher who may have, typically given more instrumental support or maybe even content support. And instead, if they provided kind of a orienting or conceptual support saying like, hey, what's your independent variable? That's the thing that you're going to want to change. Then the student goes, oh, okay, that's what I should do. And then they were able to jump right in once they had that support rather than giving them, the answer straight away. Another teacher said, I talk to my kids all the time, but it made it easier to identify like a laser what I needed to talk to them about. So, here the teacher is identifying it's not just knowing what they're struggling with, but also giving them a prompt to jump into that conversation right away that help them identify what to say in that moment. And that kind of brings us to theme 3, which is it's very similar with this idea that the tips were helping teachers with their timeliness. So one teacher said that tips saved me time to clarify what is going on. I was able to make my way around the room to more students. And when you add that up, it really saves me time. So they're able to get to more students and get to that conversation right away. And that's actually what another teacher said as well. Tips help me with starting that communication with the students. How much did that decrease the amount of time? Probably 1 to 2 minutes. I get those tips and that's what I would send the kids online. So that teacher was actually one who was engaging with students remotely. And so they were able to, copy and paste that support and send it directly to the students. So that's a really interesting way that tips could be used in an actual classroom during these times. And so kind of an overview of what we've seen so far in this preliminary study is that we have these insights for future design iterations for ink blotter with tips. And we also, these early things are suggesting that they are going to be helpful in promoting the support that teachers provide to students on science inquiry practices. And our ongoing analyses are going to look further into the log data, specifically the log data on students' performances to determine how those students' performances have changed as a result of teachers using tips in their instruction. So this brings us to kind of a broader discussion of both studies and some future research moving forward with this project. So kind of so what does this tell us about education and how we can support students on science practices? So going back to what Rachel said at the very beginning, our goal here is that we're really trying to help students learn how to do science. And these technologies like learning dashboards can be really instrumental in supporting students on these things. And so we have this kind of graphic here to show how this works. So we have these virtual science labs. We're able to get formative assessment data from these virtual science labs and give them directly to teachers through an learning dashboard. And together these things are facilitating support for all the science inquiry practices. But as Rachel noted in that first study, it might not be enough to facilitate that support. We want to improve teachers supporting students. And so then that's where TIPS comes in. It's that, that second iteration where we're able to improve teacher support, and hopefully we're able to see that moving forward, that same kind of progression where we're supporting students even more on these science inquiry practices, which is very exciting. So some of our future research includes testing the design elements that I had mentioned before for the TIPS, also examining exactly what teachers are saying whenever they're helping students with the TIPS, and running controlled comparisons to see how students' performances differed with no TIPS versus TIPS, and expanding this whole system. So both the virtual science labs and the alerting dashboard and the TIPS to support this other NGSS practice called using mathematics and science, specifically at the high school level. And so I'd like to thank the Rutgers Inklets team and the Apprentice team for all of their wonderful support in designing these amazing things, and as well as our funders for contributing to this work. So thank you. I'll open it up to questions.
Actually, we have a question in the chat from Dan. He's curious what instruction looks like for teachers before they're using Inkets compared to learning on the platform.
Yeah, absolutely, Dan. So maybe I interpret that as, for instance, like how they might be supporting inquiry on hands-on labs, for example. And so what we've seen is that there's, a lot of challenges. Specifically, we've conducted interviews with teachers in relation to when they have like class sizes of 20 students or more. First, just facilitating safe hands-on lab experimentation, but also in terms of the assessment of students' inquiry. So having to walk around to each group and then trying to capture what's happening, but at the same time, then in the end, having to rely on these lab reports where we know that sometimes what students write in the lab reports may not be like a perfect reflection of what they did during hands-on labs. And so seeing with Inkets, our teachers are able to have that overall monitoring of what's happening with students. And then that instruction that's provided does still, we've shown in some transfer studies, relate to supporting students when they go back to hands-on learning after. But certainly it's a bit of a different process because a lot of times that hands-on learning is happening in collaboration in person perhaps, or relative to, I see Janice's question too.
You got that?
Yeah, I think Rachel is onto what I was asking, which is essentially like, what does teacher instruction look like separate from Inkets? What does it look like with Inkets? And then as some of that interview data was showing, it sounded like some of the teachers were beginning to maybe change how they interacted with students, partly within the platform, but then Rachel, you were saying that this seemed to translate a little bit back to their broader instruction in terms of, like I was thinking what Amy was saying about they're much more focused in like what they're looking at, or they're delaying kind of what they're telling kids because now they're more asking questions and that kind of stuff. And I was just kind of curious to see if there was any kind of bleed over from using Inkets to the other instruction, and if like they're even doing the inquiry instruction more broadly, but then Inkets like starts to support them in thinking differently about instruction. That's just what I'm thinking about.
Yeah, definitely. And I know like teachers have actually sent Janice some examples of this, but we had some teachers who had an appreciation for how the inquiry practice stages help to kind of define what some elements of the practices are. And so they actually will design their future hands-on labs to almost reflect the types of components that were involved within the Inkets system. So students can like almost fill out a worksheet that somewhat reflects what was happening in Inkets. And it just added an element of structure, which is like a step towards, then moving towards that messier hands-on inquiry, but definitely gives like a stepping point for starting to guide that instruction in that setting as well.
Great, thanks.
Anybody else have any questions?
Yeah, I have a question. I know this is limited and you may have done this or you're looking at it, but I know as a classroom teacher, one of the things that would happen to me is over time, especially if I have multiple classes teaching the same thing over the course of the day, I could even anticipate some of the standard problems, or if I taught the same topic multiple times over multiple years, I could anticipate topics. Did you notice whether or not teachers got better or if they changed over the course of the day regarding the types of questions that they asked?
So we've had some really incredible teachers who have continued to collaborate with us for longer periods of time. These studies are definitely just a snapshot. And while we see, there are some levels of improvement within, for instance, just those like 1 to 2 class periods where we collected this data, that improvement differs extensively when we look at it across longer periods of time, which somewhat answers Kristen's question I saw in the chat too, which is that our teachers do continue to use these technologies as part of their regular classroom activities and use them often as a check-in for student progress at different points during the year. Some even use them for like student growth objectives, as like if they've mastered certain practices or not. And so but definitely for our teachers too, we see a difference in how they're using it. I think also, with any technology, that time to become familiar with all the different components, because there is a lot to explore within even the dashboard. Inkblotter has a lot happening, and sometimes in the moment in the class, time to even look through the different tips, for instance, can be limited. So with time becoming more familiar, and like you said, Randy, then seeing those trends in student performance too, all of that together definitely facilitates some growth in use of the technology.
Okay, so we answered Kristen's question too. Okay, anyone else? Let's see.
I have another question.
I have a clapping hand, not a raised hand. Anybody? If I'm not seeing you, you can just jump in.
I have another question.
Oh, go ahead, Randy. Sorry.
That's okay. Curious if there was any looking at possible confounding factors for the students who didn't jump up, like reading ability or other factors, and if that was something that you looked at as well.
Definitely in terms of like students' reading level, for instance, within the actual lab, or with like help from Rex, maybe our tutor, or
either way, either getting their reading scores from other standardized tests and possibly crossing that with student performance, or again, as possible, a confounding factor for you.
Right. No, there's definitely, in terms of the Rex supports, we've seen some instances where, for instance, we were working in special education classrooms, and our educators have said to us, sometimes what Rex might say is a little bit longer. Students won't take the time to read it if they're uncomfortable with kind of the reading level at which the supports from Rex are written. And so that sometimes, that support's not being received by the students. In this study, because we had the teacher support as the key focus, that wasn't as direct of a factor. However, there are certainly other contextual factors that are coming into play in the classroom in general that certainly we've been having discussions a lot about recently, including, what information teachers know about particular students ahead of time. So if they know a certain student tends to have difficulty with a practice, how is that relating to the support that they provide in addition to what's in the Inkblotter dashboard? And even, at least we know the dashboard would then be directing their attention at that moment towards the student, and then they might be using that prior understanding of that student's difficulties in addition to what's in the alert. But that's definitely work. We would need to do some interviewing with teachers as well to ask them about some of the decision-making process that happens when they help students with consideration of their prior understandings and other contexts. But definitely, it's not just an isolated use. There is all these other contextual variables to keep in mind too when we're interpreting this work.
Do you mind if I jump in for 1 second, Randy? So another thing that we have found, in fact, there was an AERA presentation headed up by Amy just last week on this, is we've been analyzing the data that has come in during COVID, where teachers were using our system and students were working from home remotely. And we have some really incredible data that shows that many students have done as well or better at home with INKITs than they did in their classrooms with INKITs. And some of these, many of these students, by the way, are students of color and English language learners. And it's really impressive to see the engagement that they've gotten. So teachers will tell us that, you know, kids remotely are not doing any homework, but they're doing their science homework consistently with INKITs. So we do know that this makes a huge difference, you know, vis-a-vis our robust studies, but we also know that students engage with it. They realize it's important for their learning. So for example, we surveyed something like 300 students and asked them, first of all, how did they like INKITs and how did they like their teacher's use of ink blotter, which gave them such precise data on their competencies. And we had students say, I don't necessarily like it, but I know it's important for my learning. Now, as an educator who is not very interested in gaming, for example, I will take that as a win any day because I'm not in the entertainment business. I'm in the education business. And students who realize that they have to engage epistemologically to understand how to conduct inquiry and that this is important for them is something that I think we really need to keep a focus on in school. And, you know, no slur on people who are interested in gaming, but, you know, I think that we've moved a little bit far afield from our original intention of what it means to learn and to know.
No doubt there are students who have benefited from not just online learning, but the type of interactive, and the result of teachers getting that live prompt for students, I find very, very interesting in particular. It's a very interesting time. Again, I was just curious because one of the comments that teachers made that I read was, I had no idea that this was the type of question I should ask. I thought they were having problems with something else. And we also know that teachers very often bring in their own perceptions of students. So, which is what's nice about these prompts, right? Because it gives a different baseline by which teachers can evaluate how to help students. And all help is good as far as I'm concerned, but this is particular help that I think has been effective and very interesting.
Yeah, thanks, Randy.
I had a question if we still have time.
Sure.
Yeah, so I was wondering, and Janice had touched on this a little bit in her last response, but I had two questions. One was, what was the diversity like of participants, both at the teacher level and the student level? And what did teacher professional learning around using this system look like? Was it integrated with NGSS learning? Was it independent of NGSS learning?
Great question. Yes. So for study one, we had two teachers from demographically diverse areas of the United States who were participating. And then same with our second study, preliminary and ongoing study, we have schools from all over the US, and our participating teachers and students are representing diverse socioeconomic demographics. And then in terms of that professional development component that's happening, we, in these studies specifically, provide first a focus in on the actual technologies as like a tutorial meeting. So that'll be run by one of these instructors or one of the researchers who works with the instructors who would attend the Google Classroom, for instance, implementation, or back when it was in-person implementation. And when going through the use of the technology, there's certainly integration there of how it relates to the current curriculum that they're implementing. We often select the particular lab based on, you know, the disciplinary core idea and like performance expectation that this teacher is aiming to address. But at this time for these studies, we didn't provide any explicit professional development on the standards themselves beyond what teachers were experiencing within their school. It was more focused on that technology use and how it would supplement ongoing instruction that was occurring. But definitely the level of professional development also is something we know has a huge impact on the types of questioning teachers ask and their comfort with the inquiry practices. So it's important to think about that element as well, their income and comfort with them, the practices.
Thanks, Rachel.
Thank you.
Okay, and while that was going on, we had a little chat going on about translations for ELLs. So I think we're good on that. Anyone else have a question? Okay, I'm sensing we're going to, oh, okay, there's a thank you. Okay, okay, it seems like we're all good. Yep. Everyone's thanking you for a great presentation. All right, thanks everyone for coming today. Thanks Rachel and Amy. Very interesting work for sure. Okay, so next week we'll have Christian who's on our call today. He'll be presenting some of his work. So hopefully we'll see you all next week. Until then, have a great day today. Bye, everybody.
Bye.